Hello everyone and welcome to Lecture Bite 2 for PY4112. I'm Lauren and in this lecture bite I will be discussing ethical guidelines for practice in Australia, as well as starting to explore the role of evidence-based practice in helping us to adhere to ethical principles. Before I do begin though, I would like to pause for an acknowledgement of country. I would like to respectfully acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands across Australia, their elders, ancestors, cultures, and heritage. Okay, so in the lecture bite here, I will start by going over the general principles and standards of the Australian Psychological Society's Code of Ethics, describing briefly what they are and how they are enacted. I'll then discuss the role of evidence-based practice and its link to ethical practice in psychology, before I finish up with a little activity that you can do ahead of our seminars next week. So let's begin. So as you would very likely be aware at this stage of your studies in fourth year, becoming a psychologist is quite a time-consuming endeavour. And there is a very good reason for that. Being a psychologist is a very important and quite powerful job where the goal of what a psychologist is doing is providing objective counsel and service to others, often in a time where others are in great need. But as the saying goes, with great power comes great responsibility. So the profession of psychology doesn't just let you loose with clients after 3 to 4 years of undergraduate study. Becoming a psychologist requires quite advanced levels of education and training to help equip you with the core skills that you need and the expertise that is required for the profession. And that includes knowledge of the professional ethics that guide the profession. So professional ethics are the standards of behaviour expected by, in our case, psychologists, that guide how they should behave and how they should conduct themselves when they are operating in a professional capacity. But it is worth noting that these ethical guidelines or these professional ethical guidelines, they can impact or provide a guideline on how we can behave in our personal lives, because there are often situations where professional and personal lives can collide. So for example, psychologists that might practice in small rural towns, it's not outside of the realm of possibility that one of their clients might be their child's school teacher or the local barista or something like that. It's also not unheard of in psychology for family and friends who are experiencing their own distress or their own situations to come to you for advice. So that professional code of ethics that we have do help give us guidelines and frameworks around how we should respond to those situations when the personal and the professional do collide. So professional ethics are the norms, the values, and the principles that help to guide decision-making in the profession in such a way that the decisions made by everyone in it are upholding the core values and the core integrity of the profession. So a lot of countries around the world do have their own individual code of ethics. Obviously, since most of us here are mainly in Australia, we will be focusing on the APS code of ethics. If you do happen to be studying from another country, I would encourage you to look up your own country's code of ethics. I know there are a lot that adopt the American Psychological Association. Some do have their own specific one. I know Singapore does have their own code or guide of ethics. So whatever country you're based in, have a look to see if it has its own code of ethics. So the APS code of ethics It is a public document, quite literally. Anyone can type into Google APS Code of Ethics and access that document. Now, it is made public for a good reason. There are a lot of resources that the APS provides that are only available to members, but there are some that they also would like the public to be aware of. So in the case of the code, that is meant to be accessible for both psychologists and the public so that there is a shared understanding of what constitutes ethical and not so ethical behavior from psychologists. So it's really not just for our benefit as practitioners that document exists. It's for the public as well. So it's to safeguard us as practitioners from getting into strife from poor decision making, but it also safeguards clients by protecting them from ramifications or fallout of said poor decision making. So the APS Code of Ethics is the code of ethics in psychology in Australia. People who are members of the APS must abide by that code, and it is the code that has been adopted by the Psychology Board as the code that all psychologists should adhere to. So let's have a closer look at this code of ethics. Now, first of all, the APS Code of Ethics is built on 3 core general principles. First of all, we have the principle of respect, so respect for the rights of people. So this includes their right to autonomy and justice, but it also encompasses respecting the dignity of people, acting equitably, and protecting human, legal, moral rights. Second, we have the principle of propriety, which essentially relates to competence. So as practicing psychologists, we need to ensure that we are competent to deliver the services that we're providing and that those services are benefiting, not harming those that we're providing them to. So psychologists must protect the interests of those that they work with in such a way that the welfare of clients and the public and the profession more broadly take precedence over any self-interest a psychologist might have. The third principle is all about integrity. So this is about psychologists recognizing and really owning and taking responsibility for the power that they hold and the trust that people are placing in them. So it's about exercising their power appropriately and really honoring that position of trust. So we'll break these 3 principles down just a little bit further, starting with the respect principle. So with the respect principle, there are kind of 7 standards that broadly sit within the overarching principle. And there are actually, even within these 7 standards, there are substandards and clauses for all of these. So I'm not going to go through each and every one of them individually because that will turn this lecture bite into quite a considerably lengthy lecture. They are listed and described in the APS Code of Ethics document that I referred to just before. That is one of your key readings of this week, so I do encourage you to have a look at it yourself. But the ones that I will focus on here are the key standards that fall under that respect principle. So the 7 standards are justice, respect, informed consent, privacy, confidentiality, release of information to clients, and collection of client information. And when we consider these together, the gist of them is that psychologists must show respect for people by acknowledging their legal rights, their moral rights, their dignity, and their right to participate in decisions that affect their lives. So it's about recognizing the importance of people's privacy and confidentiality, and their physical and personal integrity. So these standards here, they also capture the need to have quite a high level of regard and respect for the diversity and uniqueness of people, and where appropriate, their right to linguistically and culturally appropriate services. So also within this, psychologists also need to acknowledge people's right to be treated fairly without discrimination or favoritism, and they have to endeavour to ensure that all people have reasonable and fair access to psychological services and share in the benefits that the practice of psychology can offer. Okay, moving on to the second general principle, which is propriety. So there are 14 standards here, which again is another reason why I'm not going to go into each of them individually. It's going to take up a very long time. But again, summarizing what the gist of these principles are relating to. So these are getting at competence and boundaries, and knowing your limits, both personally and professionally. So the 14 standards that are set out as part of this principle, they are to help ensure that psychologists are practicing within the limits of their competence, and that they know and understand the legal, professional, ethical, and also, where applicable, organizational rules that regulate and guide the work that they do. And that point there about organizational rules is particularly important to consider. I know going into private practice for a lot of people is a goal that they have, but that's generally not a goal that people go straight into after a fourth year psychology. For most people, their journey into working as a practitioner will start by working for another organization. So you might work for a government department like a school or a prison. And if you're working as a psychologist, you not only have to abide by the ethical standards of psychology, but you'll also need to abide by the set of rules that are set out for the organization that you work for. Now, also encompassed in part of this principle and within these standards is that psychologists must undertake continuing professional development. Your learning as a psychologist is absolutely never done. Not after fourth year, not after masters, not after whenever you formally finish studying. Continued professional development is a big part of what we do. So psychologists have to take steps to ensure that they remain up to date with current directions in their profession, and that they are competent to practice relative to those current directions. Now, something else that's very important that is captured within this principle is the need for adequate self-care. And that is the need for psychologists to be aware that the work that we do can have an impact on our own physical and mental well-being. And we need to be aware of our own boundaries in this respect and manage ourselves so that it does not impact our ability to practice competently. It's the good old oxygen mask analogy that I'm sure we've all heard of. I guess finally, the last thing to point out with these standards that are encompassed within this principle is that these standards specify that psychologists must anticipate, where foreseeable, the consequences of the professional decisions that they make, and provide services that are beneficial to people and do not harm them, and take responsibility for professional decisions. Okay, so the final principle, integrity, that has 7 standards that sit underneath it, and again, some substandards that sit underneath these 7 points here of reputable behaviour, communication, conflict of interest, non-exploitation, authorship, financial arrangements, and ethical investigations and concerns. Now, again, focusing on the big picture of what these standards are getting at, these are the standards that specify that psychologists need to basically recognize their position of power. They need to recognize the position of trust that they have, and that position will require them to be honest and objective, and that they must be at all times committed to the best interests of both their clients and their profession. These standards as well, they tap into some of the things that we discussed in our first class or in our first week, in that psychologists need to be aware of their own biases, limits to their objectivity, and the importance of maintaining proper boundaries. Now, notice that I said that psychologists need to be aware of their own biases. I didn't say they can't have biases. Everyone has biases. The key thing is that we need to be aware of them, which is something that we spoke about last week and will continue to speak about throughout the semester as we delve into the role of reflective practice a bit more. Now, the more we can be aware of these biases, the more they can assist us with making sure that we are maintaining those proper boundaries with clients, that we can avoid potential conflicts of interest, and refrain from exploiting clients intentionally or unintentionally. So I guess to sum it up, the whole APS code of ethics, particularly this principle here, it's about acting honestly, acting with integrity, being transparent, and holding oneself accountable for the decisions that we make. Now, just in terms of accountability, something that's worth pointing out is that while the APS does set out the guidelines for ethical practice, they are not the ones that handle complaints when things go haywire or where there might be concerns. That is actually done through the Psychology Board of Australia, where members of the public or other psychologists can raise their concerns about practitioners. I've got some examples on the slide here of 2 real-life examples. These are obviously quite serious ones. If it ends up on the APRA website, they are generally more serious cases. But if you are interested to have a look at the types of real-life situations that have resulted in suspension or disqualification for a psychologist, have a scroll through the APRA website. Okay. So what I want to do now that we've kind of outlined the core principles that are encompassed within the APS Code of Ethics, as well as the standards that kind of show how those principles are enacted, I want to take a look at the role of evidence-based practice in ethical practice. Some of the standards that I just spoke about there are more about moral behaviour. Others are more about discipline knowledge. And I guess evidence-based practice is where those things intersect, because being a practitioner that behaves and conducts oneself ethically is about being able to make good evidence-informed decisions. So evidence-based practice by 4th year psychology is not likely to be a new term for you. It is potentially one you would have heard of before. And I guess, it's one of those terms that on the surface might seem somewhat self-explanatory. because evidence-based practice is using evidence to inform practice, which is essentially it. But there is a little bit more nuance to what it is than that, which is why I really like the definition of it that is on the slide here, because that's much more holistic. So evidence-based practice is the integration of the best available research with clinical expertise in the context of client characteristics, culture, and preferences. Now, this is a great definition because it emphasizes these additional factors that we need to take into consideration when making decision about what is the best and most ethical course of action for a particular client, because evidence-based practice is more than just knowing what the research says is the most evidence-based thing to do. And I'll talk about this in just a minute because research isn't perfect. One of the reasons that just looking at the research evidence alone to inform decision-making is that, the research base of evidence can be, it has its own biases and limitations that we need to keep in mind. One of the key issues, particularly, I guess, with more clinical psychology work or anyone that's working in the intervention space, is the efficacy versus effectiveness thing. Not a lot, a lot of research, a lot of scientific literature, not all of it, but I would say most of it, that is looking at efficacy. So efficacy is how well a treatment or intervention performs under ideal controlled setting. So it is your standard randomized controlled trial where you control your environment, you control your settings, and you test your intervention compared to a placebo group. Effectiveness, on the other hand, is how well an intervention or treatment performs when you take it out of that controlled environment and put it into the real world. Now, conducting research does come with its own code of ethics. There are ethical codes that do guide what researchers can and can't do, and there are certain principles that researchers need to abide by. One of them is do no harm, which is obviously there for a good reason. But sometimes because of those ethical guidelines that researchers need to adhere to, doing studies that look at the effectiveness of something, so how something performs in the real world, is actually quite challenging because it wouldn't pass, or it's unlikely to pass an ethical board of approval, because in the real world there are lots of things that could go wrong. So that's why a lot of the studies that we do see in the literature, they look at efficacy because it's done in controlled settings. So it does help to alleviate some of the ethical issues that are involved in research. It also does actually help to enhance, in some respects, the rigor of the research. But the flip side of that is it doesn't always translate to the real world. Another issue with just looking at the research evidence itself is that there are publication biases in what actually gets published into journals. And while there's certainly been quite a lot of improvement in this regard in, say, the last 5 to 7 years, typically speaking, journals, the ones that you would go to look at your research evidence, they tend to only publish findings that are statistically significant, and they don't necessarily publish studies where the findings aren't significant. Now, what that means is that You might be looking at what the research evidence says for a particular treatment and thinking, wow, look at all the evidence for this. There are so many studies that have shown that it's significant in fixing or addressing this, and this. But you're only seeing the results of studies where it's worked. For every study that is published that does find significant results, there might be another 5, 10, 20, 50, 100, we don't know, studies that don't get published because they don't show any significant effect. So let's say, for example, if 1 in 10 studies that looked at an intervention found significant results, can we really say it is effective if 9 times out of 10 it's not showing any significant differences? Who knows? So there's definitely been improvement, and there is definitely move towards publishing non-significant results, particularly in the intervention space, for that very reason. But there is still that bias within the literature itself. Another thing to point out, it's not really so much a bias per se, I'd say it's more of a trend, but there are just some things that are simply studied more than others. So the literal amount of evidence for them is greater than others. And cognitive behavior therapy, CBT, is a great example of this. CBT is one of the gold standards in therapy for many different things, and there is absolutely no doubt that the evidence for CBT is quite strong. But if we take a critical lens to the body of literature, you could argue that this might be because CBT is studied a lot more than other types of interventions, and generally what it is studied against, so what it is compared to, is nothing. So it's generally a case where you'll find a CBT intervention compared to a control group. There are fewer studies, and I'm not saying none, they definitely do exist. There are some studies that might look at, say, comparing cognitive behavior therapy to DBT, to another form of therapy, to a control group. Those ones do tend to be a little bit stronger because you're getting multiple comparison points. But just generally speaking, some things have more evidence in support of them simply by the fact that they are studied more. So I guess bringing that all together, evidence-based practice requires really great critical thinking skills because it will require you to have the ability to reconcile information from multiple different sources to form a clinical judgment. So you'll need to consider, what does the research evidence say about the particular therapy or intervention that I'm considering here? What does my expertise, my lived experience working with people that have this presenting issue, what does that tell me? And what are the client characteristics? So what are the characteristics of this client that I need to take into consideration when deciding what I might do in this case? Which might sound like a lot, but the APS do try to help, facilitate part of that by ensuring that its ethical standards do reflect the latest evidence. And they also publish summaries of some of the research for particular psychological treatments and interventions. So I'm going to be posting one of the more recent summaries of evidence-based interventions that the APS compiles on the materials this week. And I guess to finish up, we will take a look at one of them and leave you with an activity that you can try out if you like to help think about how you might draw on those multiple sources, because evidence-based practice is not so straightforward. So this will be on a discussion board. You're welcome to post your answers there, but you can just have a look through the materials and consider your response by yourself. So I want you to imagine that you are a clinician who specializes in stress and pain disorders, and you are trained and experienced in cognitive behavior therapy, EMDR, and hypnotherapy. You receive a referral for a 42-year-old male client named Max, who was witness to a violent crime and has since been diagnosed with PTSD and pain disorder. So Max has tried CBT for over 12 months, and while there was some improvement, it appeared to plateau and hasn't really improved much since then. And in the referral, he has requested that he wants to also receive hypnotherapy alongside CBT. So what I want you to do is have a read of the evidence-based psychological interventions in the treatment of mental disorders document that I will post. It is one of these summary documents that the APS does put together. Have a read and decide, based on the APS Code of Ethics and what this summary document presents about the evidence, have a think about what the ethical issues might be if you do decide that you will do hypnotherapy with Max, but also have a think about what the ethical issues might be if you don't decide to do hypnotherapy with Max, and try and have a think about what you would do and why. So which course of action would you take and why would you do it? Now, there are not necessarily any right or wrong answers here. This is really just an exercise to start to get you thinking about how you reconcile these code of ethics alongside the evidence base. Okay, so that is it for this lecture bite. Thank you very much for listening. I do hope you enjoyed it, and we will see you in the seminars or the workshops this week when we will be exploring ethics in practice a little bit further. Thank you very much. Bye.